Okay. Alright, let's start with the phone specs and the hardware when using these phones as my daily driver. Now what's interesting is that both phones carry the same Snapdragon 870 chipset, and while I had no issues with the particular chipset as it did a very well job on both performance and the thermal regulations, but of course the fact that it is using the same chipset as last year, it may be something worth considering if you want a so-called new experience. Now, in terms of the weight, what's interesting is that although on paper, according to POCO's official specs, the POCO F4 is supposed to weigh at 195 grams, but when I measured it on the weighing scale, it shows that it was at 196 grams instead. And that's the reason why I decided to go beyond and measure the POCO F4 myself, because the POCO F3 was also at 195 grams, which made me wonder that no way that the POCO F4 was weighing the same. So yes, my suspicions were true. Now you may say, but Adam, that is just a 1 gram difference. Well, here's the thing. Even though it was only a mere 1 gram in difference, but when I use both phones daily, instead of it feeling like just 1 grams heavier, it did seem like the POCO F4 was a bit more than 1 grams heavier, but yeah, that is how is my experience when I use these phones daily. And as expected, because the POCO F3 had a matte finish compared to the POCO F4's glossier finish, and it was also very prone to dust near the camera bump area, I really preferred how the POCO F3 felt compared to the POCO F4. However, because of the squared camera bump shape on the POCO F4, the phone was way more usable to type when you place it on a surface compared to how wobbly it was on the POCO F3. So if you are one of those people who loves to leave your phone on the table while typing, like what I usually do when I'm working, then you'll appreciate the POCO F4 even more. Now, while the placements of the ports and buttons are the same, but the speakers looks a little different, which did not affect the volume at all, but based on my test, the audio vocal quality on the POCO F4 was definitely better than the POCO F3, and here is a very quick sound test. Now, I did mention in my first impressions video on how the side fingerprint button was more of a button. That was true, but if you really compared side by side with the POCO F3, it was the same, and so was the overall unlocking speeds. So if it wasn't for the wobbling on the table situation, the POCO F3 would totally win this build quality and hardware battle. But for me, that is not such of a big deal, but still, I would give my vote towards the POCO F3 over here. Now, another thing that I mentioned in the first impressions video for the POCO F4 is how I mentioned that this is the best mid-range smartphone display that I've ever seen out right now. And while yes, it is using the same exact POCO F3 display panel, and it also had the same resolution as well, but the reason why I felt that the POCO F4 performed better, firstly is because of the automatic brightness adjustments, where no matter the type of environment that I was in, whether or not it's on a bright situation or even in the dark, it did perform very well compared to the POCO F3. So with that, I will stick to the same point that this is the best mid-range smartphone display that I've tested thus far, even beating Samsung's very own A73 as well. So other than that, you'll be having the same excellent quality screen that you'd get on the POCO F3 when watching videos, especially on Dolby Vision content on both as well, where both had the Widevine L1 and with the Dolby Vision certified in Netflix as well. But where the POCO F4 also wins is the fact that it has the adaptive display refresh rate compared to the POCO F3, where you only had the option to choose between 120Hz and 60Hz and not adaptive. So yes, although we are looking at the same hardware, but because of the software enhancements, it made the POCO F4 my choice for a better display compared to the POCO F3. The cameras. Now here is where This could be the differentiating factor between choosing both of these phones, because remember, it is not always the higher megapixel count that is the best. Now, as a recap of the specs, the POCO F3 has a 48 megapixel f1.8 main lens, an 8 megapixel f2.2 ultra-wide lens, and a 5 megapixel f2.4 macro lens. Then the POCO F4 has a bigger 64 megapixel f1.8 main lens, a similar 8 megapixel f2.2 ultra-wide lenses, and a weirdly smaller 2 megapixel f2.4 macro camera. And as for the front camera, it has a 20 megapixel f2.5 aperture for both phones. Let's start with the high megapixel mode. At a glance on the first images, you won't find any difference in quality, where the overall image on the POCO F4 was a bit more cooler in the color temperature. And when it comes to the detail, even if you zoom in close towards the Klana square sign, you can't tell the difference even though the POCO F4 has a bigger megapixel count. And the same could be said for this second image as well when it comes to the color temperature, just a bit. But when you punch in closer to the McDonald's logo, the word through in the drive-through was a bit clearer on the POCO F4, but yeah, I don't think that you or anyone is going to be zooming that close when you take images, so that's why I am here for. Then images on the ultra-wide lenses were identical since it uses the same exact lens for both during the day, and the same could be also said for the main lenses in the non-high megapixel mode for all of the images. However, there's only a tiny bit of a color shift when you use the 2x zoom on the POCO F3, where it was a bit more consistent on the POCO F4, but not extremely noticeable, but yes, it was there. And if you zoom in closer to 10 times, you'll find that the POCO F4 is once again only a tad bit sharper. Then portrait mode on subject was pretty flawless on the edge detection, but the dynamic range on the POCO F4 was a bit better on the blurred background area, as seen in this second image on the background of the cone, where the clouds towards the top left was a bit blown out, but overall both performed very well in even situations where there was more subject during this mode as well. So the macro mode was a bit of a different story because even though the megapixel count on the F4 was smaller, but it did better on getting the details of the close-up shots, but at the expense of a quite color shift on the first image. And sometimes I found it harder to get focus when you put the POCO F4 closer. I do get a sharper shot when it's a bit further, but that is at the expense of a more noisier image surrounding the subject. And while the POCO F3 says that it is focused in the camera app, but the photos is not as sharp. So overall, I would say that the macro shots on the POCO phones, the POCO F3 and the POCO F4, wouldn't be the best traits. Now switching over to taking photos at night, on the ultra-wide lenses, both was very similar, but I did see that the POCO F4 had deeper blacks, but the highlights of both kept very well on this first image. However, if you take a look at this second image, I like how the text on the concourse entrance was sharper and more readable on the POCO F3 compared to the POCO F4, so I do suspect that this is surely due to the software processing, so keep that in mind. As for the ultra-low light situations, the POCO F4 performs better with accurate colors and more details on the floor area towards the bottom right side of the image. And looking at the night images for the main lens, the images was also identical on both lenses, as seen in these two back-to-back images. Now, if you really need to take selfie shots at night, the POCO F4's image processing does a way better job at the skin tones, and there's even better dynamic range at the highlights, especially towards the left side of the image. And the skin tone stayed consistently on the portrait selfie during a night for the POCO F4, especially on this second selfie portrait image, where the POCO F3 did not do a great job on the edge detection. However, it was a totally different story when you're taking selfies during the day, as the POCO F3 does a better job on the skin tones and the background dynamic range for this first shots. But the POCO F4 does better on the details and the skin tones in this second image, so this shows how inconsistent both phones' front camera are. Now, speaking of the inconsistency, the POCO F4's portrait mode shots for the selfie camera was nowhere as good as the POCO F3 as seen in this first image, but the overall edge detection could be a hit or miss on both phones most of the time. So another software enhancement were made on the recording resolution. While both records at up to 1080p 30 frames per second for the ultra-wide lenses, but the POCO F4 can go up to 60 frames per second on the 4K resolution, which I don't use that high of a frame rate, but I do know some of y'all who does, so keep that in mind. Now when it comes to the video quality on the ultra-wide lenses, it was very close to each other, probably just a tad bit different on the color of the blue skies, but not highly apparent, and the stabilization for these ultra-wide lenses was equally as good. Then the 4K video quality was also a similar case, where the only difference was a slight difference of colors of the skies, and the image stabilization over here was really good as well. Now as for taking videos at night, I found that the POCO F4 was a little better for the main lenses. Then when it comes to the ultra-wide lenses, the video footage seems to favor the POCO F3 in capturing highlights a little better. Next, let's see how both cameras' audio and video recording is for a more vlogging situation, so you can be the judge. Okay, so this is a front video test both for audio and video. Also testing out the stabilization to see how it is. Now, one thing that I've noticed is that when I play back both of the videos, it will show Dolby Atmos, so I believe it is recording in Dolby Atmos. But yeah, this is for you to hear how it is. I am on a kind of a rooftop area, so you can hear there's a lot of background noise, but hopefully you can hear me. But one most important thing is for us to find out how does it fare in terms of the comparison of how the audio records on both. So test 1, 2, test 1, 2, test 1, 2. So guys, with this, do let me know which one do you think won in this camera comparison. Was it huge differences, and which one would you choose? Let me know in the comment section below. And if you're enjoying this video, a thumbs up would be very much appreciated, and a subscription would be nice too, because these videos are really not easy to do. So the battery spec seems to be another strange situation, as the POCO F3 has 4520 mAh battery and the POCO F4 has 4500 mAh, so we're looking at a difference of 20 mAh. And here is where size does not matter, because not only did the battery drain from 100% to 99% got me about 54 minutes of screen on time, where it even got me 5 hours and 11 minutes of screen on time when I was still at 50% battery. So the overall battery usage was significantly better when it comes to getting an average of 7 hours and 48 minutes of screen on time compared to the POCO F3, where I was averaging at only about 7 hours. Now keep in mind that I also forced the POCO F4 to be on the higher refresh rate of 120Hz instead of the default or dynamic, just to be fair to go against the POCO F3. Hence this means that the POCO F4 will give you better battery life if you switch to the dynamic refresh rate mode. And of course, where the POCO F3 also wins is through the charging capabilities, where it has 67 watts compared to 33 watts on the POCO F3. So it did got me up and running close to 40 minutes from 0% to 100% of charge compared to almost an hour on the POCO F3. So yes, the obvious winner over here is the POCO F4 when it comes to the battery department. So my biggest worry as a long-time user of the POCO F3 was whether or not I would get the latest Android software update. Because I don't really care about MIUI, since it's not exactly my favorite Android skin, but I have been living with it. But the cool thing is that as of the recording of this video, not only does the POCO F3 has the latest Android 12 update, but the MIUI update was at version 13.0.6 compared to 13.0.4 on the POCO F4. But using both phones daily was totally fine, as I had no issues or any lag or any stuttering when using both phones daily. So besides the slight UI difference in the control center, where the POCO F4 had the volume and the screen brightness slider towards the right instead of placing it below on the POCO F3, there was no significant difference in terms of the usability for both phones. And what's interesting is that even though that the POCO F3 had a higher RAM compared to the POCO F4, I did not feel any differences once again. There was no overheating issues with the chipset as expected, and the haptic feedback on both phones were equally as good. So if RAM doesn't matter for daily usage, how about when it comes to gaming? Well, based on my test, starting with Genshin Impact on the POCO F3, the best settings were at medium graphics, 60 FPS and motion blur turned off, where the game ran smoothly with no visible stutter or micro lag. Then the battery drain was also not present, and it was only a little warm at about 15 minutes into the game, and as how it was before, the graphics look great because of its screen. Then as for COD Mobile, the graphics were at very high and the frame rate was at ultra, and the game felt very optimized and ran smoothly As for the POCO F4, to my surprise, the settings were the same except the motion blur was turned on and still the game ran pretty nice and smooth compared to the POCO F3, and I barely felt any warmth to the phone even during long gameplay. Then battery wise, after about 15 minutes of gameplay, it only lost about 2 to 3% of battery life. Then switching over to COD Mobile, the graphics were at very high, but the frame rate was at max instead of ultra, which was a little weird. But nevertheless, the gaming experience was really good and felt a tad bit more responsive than the POCO F3. So in conclusion, which should you get? Well, here's my take. I humbly believe that there are differences between the POCO F4 and the previous POCO F3. While the differences are not a lot, but it was very noticeable in the battery life and the build quality overall as well. So is the POCO F4 a better phone than the POCO F3? Yes, it is. But it also means that the price has dropped tremendously on the POCO F3, and depending where you're from, the POCO F3 could be a steal of a price, but as usual, who cares what I think? What matters more is what you think. So do let me know in the comment section below on which one that you would choose, and let's discuss it over there.